Okay, let's unpack this Sri Lanka situation. A beautiful island, absolutely, but recently facing a really serious energy crunch.
Hmm. And the numbers are quite stark, aren't they? Spending up to half of their export income just on imported fuels.
Half. I mean, can you imagine that kind of drain on your economy? It's huge.
It really is, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're looking at the study titled Looking Island-Wide to Overcome Sri Lanka's Energy Crisis While Gaining Independence from Fossil Fuel Imports.
Right.
It directly tackles that link between economic health and energy sources. When you rely so heavily on imports, you're just incredibly vulnerable.
Absolutely. And that's the core of our discussion today, all based on this detailed scientific paper. It's not just wishful thinking, it's a rigorous look at whether Sri Lanka could actually power itself.
Entirely with its own renewables.
Yes, by 2050,
Yeah.
covering everything, power, heat, transport, even desalination, all renewable.
And what's really valuable about this study, I think, is its scope. It looks at the entire energy system.
Right.
Often these discussions focus mainly on electricity, right? But this research digs into all the major ways energy is used. Heat, transport.
Give you a much clearer picture.
Exactly. Of the real challenges and the opportunities, too.
So our plan today is to follow the study's path. They use some pretty advanced modeling to map out different futures for Sri Lanka.
Right. Different transition pathways.
And our mission really is to understand how feasible is this energy independence? What are the costs, the benefits, what hurdles might they face? All according to this research.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Where was Sri Lanka around 2020, based on the study's baseline?
Well, their total primary energy demand was about 145.8 TWH. And interestingly, a lot of that came from oil, but also bioenergy.
Yeah, things like wood, agricultural residues, that was a big chunk.
And it's easy to forget, Sri Lanka wasn't always like this. Until the mid-90s, hydropower was king. It dominated electricity generation.
Right, until 1995. But then something happened.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. A major power crisis in 1996. Droughts hit the hydro hard, and that forced them to start importing fossil fuels. Fast forward to 2019, and the electricity mix had completely flipped. Oil was 34%, coal 33%, and hydro was down to 30%.
Wow, that's a dramatic shift, driven by that one crisis event, really.
It embedded that reliance on imports. And as this study emphasizes, that became this huge economic burden. That 50% of export earnings figure just keeps coming up.
You can see how that builds instability right into the economy. Shaky foundations.
Precisely. And another point the study makes, while electrification rates were high, like nearly everyone had access. The cost of that electricity was a problem. It meant lower income groups really struggled to afford a reliable supply.
That's a critical point about energy justice, isn't it? Access isn't just about connection, it's about affordability, too.
Definitely. Then, boom, the 2022 economic crisis and those awful fuel shortages.
Yeah.
That just hammered home how urgent the need was to move away from fossil fuels.
But the good news, and the study points this out clearly, is that Sri Lanka has options. It's got its own resources.
Abundant resources. Sunshine for solar, good wind potential, the existing hydro, sustainable biomass.
Exactly. Tapping into those provides inherent stability. It buffers you from global market shocks. This study sees those local renewables as the crucial building blocks.
And we can't ignore the climate angle either. Sri Lanka's already feeling the impacts, right?
Oh, absolutely. Monsoon disruptions, droughts, floods, landslides.
Yeah.
It's already happening.
And burning more fossil fuels just accelerates that.
Which makes Sri Lanka, as this large island nation with its own grid and these climate vulnerabilities, a really fascinating case study.
Yeah. Understanding their transition potential is relevant for so many other places facing similar pressures.
Okay, so how did this study actually model these potential futures? What was the approach?
Right, so they used this detailed computer model, simulated energy supply and demand hour by hour, right across different regions of Sri Lanka, projecting out to 2050.
That hourly detail is so important because solar and wind, they fluctuate, right? So you need that granularity to realistically figure out grid stability, storage needs, all of that. And the regional breakdown helps too. Different areas have different needs and resources.
So 3 main pathways were modeled. First, the best policy scenario, or BPS.
Okay.
This is the most ambitious. It finds the least cost way to get to 100% renewable energy by 2050.
Using only Sri Lanka's own resources.
Exactly. And across all sectors, power, heat, transport, the lot.
So the BPS represents the kind of maximum potential, what's technically and economically feasible if you really go for it.
Then there's the delayed policy scenario, DPS. This one's more aligned with the Ceylon electricity boards, the CEB's plans from a few years back.
More renewables than before, but not fully committed.
Right. It gets to about 17% renewable electricity, excluding the big hydro, by 2039. But it doesn't push for 100% renewables in heat or desalination, for instance.
Okay, so that shows the impact of a partial transition, tackling electricity somewhat, but leaving other sectors behind.
And finally, the current policy scenario, CPS. This basically reflects the CEB's reference plan from 2020. Very minimal growth in new renewables.
Like how minimal?
Just 2% from solar and wind by 2039. So pretty much maintaining the status quo.
Got it. So the CPS is the baseline, showing what happens if things don't change much.
And what I found really interesting is that this study didn't just look at big power plants.
Yeah.
It included things like rooftop solar prosumers, they call them, and it specifically analyzed heat, transport, and desalination.
Which often get left out of these analyses, as the study notes.
Exactly. It gives that much more complete picture.
That's a real strength, seeing how a full transition could work.
They even divided the country into 4 zones for regional analysis, based on population, electricity demand.
Crucial for the practical side. Grid planning, where do you put the wind farms, the solar plants, that kind of thing.
Okay, let's get into the findings. What did this study, looking island-wide, Caravoli, discover, starting with energy demand? How much energy would Sri Lanka need in these different futures?
Well, the projections for 2050 vary quite a bit. The total primary energy demand, the PED, it's lowest in the BPS, the 100% renewable one, about 216 TWH.
Lower than the others. That seems counterintuitive.
It does initially, but the study explains it's about efficiency. Fossil fuel systems, especially coal plants, have huge energy losses.
Ah, okay. Lots of waste heat.
Exactly. So in the DPS, demand is higher, 268 TWH, and in the CPS, it's even higher, 293 TWH, because you need more raw energy input due to those losses. Renewable systems are inherently more efficient at converting energy.
Makes sense. So less overall energy needed if you go fully renewable. What are the main sources in the BPS by 2050?
It's overwhelmingly solar PV, a massive 84% of primary energy.
84%.
Yeah. Then wind power at 11%, and the rest is existing hydro and some sustainable biomass.
Wow. Compare that to the other scenario.
Totally different picture. In the DPS and CPS, coal is still the dominant source. We're talking 47% and 57% of primary energy, respectively. Still heavily reliant.
That really paints the contrast, doesn't it? A complete energy transformation in the BPS.
Absolutely. And look at where that energy goes. In the BPS, by 2050, the biggest energy user is transportation, 56% of the total.
Because it's getting electrified.
Largely, yes. Electric vehicles, synthetic fuels derived from electricity, whereas in the DPS and CPS, the power sector itself remains the biggest energy consumer, around 48–50%.
Reflecting those inefficiencies again.
Exactly. And look at the final renewable energy share by 2050. BPS, 100% obviously. DPS, only 15%. CPS, a tiny 6%.
Goodness. That clearly shows the different levels of ambition or lack thereof. BPS is the only one achieving real independence.
And interestingly, the final electricity demand is actually highest in the BPS.
Higher electricity use.
Yeah, it makes up 70% of the total final energy demand because so much more is electrified transport, heat, compared to 61% in DPS and just 52% in CPS.
So electricity becomes the main energy carrier.
It's the key pathway to cleaning up almost everything.
And there was another efficiency point in the study about the ratio of final energy to primary energy.
Ah, yes. The BPS has a higher ratio. Basically, less energy is wasted converting primary sources into useful final energy.
So you're not just using cleaner energy, you're using it more effectively.
That efficiency gain is a really significant, often overlooked benefit of renewables. Less primary energy needed for the same outcome.
Okay, now the big question. Money. Costs. This study compared the total system costs up to 2050 for all 3 scenarios. What did it find?
This is where it gets really compelling. The BPS, the 100% renewable path. It's the cheapest.
Fair, really?
Yes, significantly. Total cumulative cost by 2050 for BPS is projected at 207 billion euros. Compare that to 271 billion for DPS and 290 billion for CPS.
Wow. So going fully renewable is actually the most economical choice in the long run. That counters the narrative you often hear.
It absolutely does. Now, the study is clear. The BPS is more capital-intensive upfront. You have to build all the solar, the wind, the storage.
Right, big investments needed.
But the long-term savings come from completely eliminating fuel costs. You start buying coal, oil, gas year after year.
So it shifts the spending profile. More upfront investment, much lower running costs.
Exactly. From paying constantly for fuel to investing in infrastructure that provides cheap energy for decades.
And this shows up in the cost of electricity itself, right? The LCOE.
Dramatically. Levelized cost of electricity, basically the average lifetime cost per unit. In the BPS, it plummets from 82 euros per NWH in 2020 down to just 34 euros in 2050.
Why such a big drop?
Two main reasons. Zero fuel costs, obviously, and zero carbon costs. Plus, the cost of renewable tech itself keeps falling.
That's a game changer, making clean electricity genuinely cheaper.
Now compare that to the other scenarios. In the DPS, the LCOE actually increases to 120 euros per MWH by 2050.
Increases.
Yes. And in the CPS, it goes even higher, to 140 euros, because they're still paying for fuel, and they likely face rising carbon prices.
That stark difference really underlines the economic risk of not transitioning, doesn't it? Sticking with fossil fuels looks increasingly expensive.
Precisely. And the study briefly mentions similar trends for the cost of heat and overall energy. The BPS hold a long-term cost advantage there, too.
So the economic case seems really strong across the board for the BPS.
It does. It suggests investing fully in renewables is the smartest financial move for Sri Lanka, according to this analysis.
Okay, so let's visualize this BPS system in 2050. How does the energy actually flow? The study paints a detailed picture. Primary energy demand, 216 TWH. Final demand, 170 TWH.
And solar power is just dominant. Single-axis tracking PV panels that follow the sun, they provide 72% of the primary energy.
72%. That really leverages Sri Lanka's solar potential.
Absolutely. But you need to manage the intermittency. Sun doesn't shine 247.
So storage.
Crucial. Battery storage meets a massive 34% of the final electricity demand in this scenario. That's a huge reliance.
A third of the electricity demand met by batteries shows how vital they become.
Essential for grid stability, balancing supply and demand day to day. The modeling suggests around 6 hours of storage needed on average.
But it's not just batteries, is it? The study talks about power to X.
Right. This is using renewable electricity to create other things.
Yeah.
Mostly clean fuels.
Like hydrogen.
Hydrogen, yes, through electrolysis. And then potentially using that hydrogen, maybe combined with captured CO2 to make synthetic methane or other liquid fuels, e-fuels.
And why do you need those?
For sectors that are hard to electrify directly, think long-haul trucks, shipping, aviation.
Ah.
The study projects about 65.5 TWh of electricity going into these power-to-X processes. It acts as a bridge, turning clean electricity into usable fuels.
So specifically e-kerosene and e-diesel for things like trains, ships, planes.
Exactly. While road transport largely shifts to battery electric vehicles, BEVs.
Got it. So a mix. Direct electrification where possible, clean fuels where needed. What about heating?
The BPS envisions meeting heat demand for industry. Homes, mainly through district heating networks.
Okay, and what powers those?
A mix. Largely efficient heat pumps, electric resistant heaters when needed, potentially some hydrogen, and crucially, capturing waste heat from industrial processes or even the electrolysis units. Very integrated.
Smart. Using heat that would otherwise be wasted. Bioenergy plays a role too.
A smaller but important role, mainly producing biomethane, a renewable natural gas.
For what?
Can be used in transport, for heating, or even burned in flexible combined heat and power plants for electricity and heat when needed. It adds flexibility.
And what about rooftop solar, the prosumers?
They make a significant contribution in the BPS, up to 12% of the total primary energy demand, and meeting about 20% of their own electricity needs directly.
That's quite substantial, empowering local generation.
Definitely. Reduces grid strain, promotes local independence. So the big picture for BPS in 2050.
No more fossil fuel imports.
None. Complete energy independence based on indigenous renewables and storage. It's a compelling vision.
Now, just briefly, what about the other scenarios in 2050? The CPS?
Very different. Still heavily reliant on coal, 57% of primary energy. Low renewable share, high losses from inefficient coal plants. Transport still dominated by fossil fuels. Much lower overall efficiency, around 64%.
Basically, business as usual with all the downsides. And the DPS.
Better than CPS, but still not great. Less coal, but it's still the biggest source at 56%. Higher renewable share, more battery and pumped hydro storage. Some electrification of heat. Efficiency is better, 78%.
So some progress, but still fundamentally tied to fossil fuels and their problems.
Exactly. Comparing the energy flows really highlights how transformative the BPS path is. Cleaner and much more efficient.
The study also looked regionally within the BPS. How is power generated and shared across the island?
It found, unsurprisingly, that the main driver of electricity cost in each region is the cost of generation itself.
Makes sense. And what kind of power plants dominate?
The biggest capacities are projected to be those tracking solar farms, rooftop PV, and onshore wind. Coal plants are completely phased out by 2050 in this scenario.
A definite shift in infrastructure. Did they find imbalances between regions?
Yes. Interestingly, the northern province emerges as a net exporter of electricity.
Ah, good solar and wind resources there, presumably.
Likely. While the other three zones, the two central provinces and the southern province, are projected to be net importers to varying degrees.
Which underlines the need for a strong transmission grid, right? To move that power around efficiently.
Absolutely crucial in a renewables-heavy system. You need to connect the resource-rich areas with the demand centers.
Okay, finally, the big environmental indicator, CO2 emissions. How do the scenarios compare?
The difference is staggering. Cumulative CO2 emissions by 2050, BPS is around 302 million tons.
Okay, and the other?
DPS is 1,307 million tons.
Yeah.
CPS is even higher, 345 million tons.
Good grief, that's 4 to 5 times higher.
Exactly. The BPS essentially stabilizes emissions after an initial period, while they just keep climbing steeply in the DPS and CPS.
The study put that in perspective relative to 2020 levels too, didn't it?
It did. BPS emissions are about 10 times 2020 levels cumulatively by 2050, reflecting some fossil use during the transition. But DPS and CPS are 48 and 58 times higher, respectively.
Huge difference, and it's not just CO2.
Correct. The BPS, by phasing out fossil fuels, also eliminates other harmful air pollutants, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, big co-benefits for public health.
So moving into the study's discussion points, those benefits of the BPS really stand out. The cost savings, first off.
Yeah, 41% lower total cost than DPS, 51% lower than CPS. That's huge.
Driven mainly by cutting out those fuel imports.
Primarily, the study reiterates how much Sri Lanka was spending that 3.7 billion USD on oil and coal in 2021 alone. 18% of all imports.
And that figure from 2014, where net energy imports were 50% of total energy use, highest among its neighbors.
That level of dependence is just economically tripling long-term. The BPS offers a path to redirect that massive spending inward.
The study quantifies the cumulative fuel cost savings too, right?
Yes. BPS total fuel cost by 2050, about 67.6 billion USD for the entire system. DPS, 153 billion. CPS, 167 billion.
Wow. Less than half the fuel cost in the BPS compared to the others.
And specifically for power generation, the BPS fuel costs are way lower than even the CEB's own projections, which assumed continued fossil fuel reliance. The economic case is just very strong.
Beyond cost, there's energy security. That's a major theme.
Absolutely. The BPS provides security through self-sufficiency, relying on your own sun, wind, water, biomass, and storage.
A stark contrast to the vulnerability shown by the recent fuel crisis.
Precisely. It builds resilience. And the study highlights how the mix of storage helps batteries for short-term balancing, pumped hydro, thermal storage, even gas storage for hydrogen or biomethane for longer-term or seasonal balancing.
A diverse toolkit for reliability.
Exactly.
What about land use? That's always a concern with large-scale renewables.
The study addresses it. It estimates about 690 square kilometers needed for utility-scale solar PV in the BPS by 2050.
Which sounds like a lot, but how does that compare?
Well, it's significant. But the study also notes wind power uses only a fraction of available land, and it suggests solutions to minimize impact.
Like floating solar.
Floating solar on reservoirs, potentially offshore later, and agri-PV combining solar panels with agriculture on the same land. Ways to make it work.
So, manageable challenges, it seems. And environmentally, the CO2 reduction is obviously a massive benefit.
Huge. The BPS aligns with the need to stabilize emissions, unlike the other paths which head in the wrong direction, environmentally speaking.
The study kind of sums up the BPS as a solar-to-X economy, doesn't it?
It does. With 84% of primary energy from solar, driven by its low cost, it becomes the engine for everything else. Direct electrification and indirect via power to X.
Solar is the cornerstone.
Absolutely. And the study notes this aligns with findings from other island decarbonization, studies the importance of solar and storage. But it stresses the need for supportive policies in Sri Lanka to actually make it happen.
Of course. Technology is one thing, policy is another. Did they compare Sri Lanka to other South Asian countries?
Briefly, yes. Similar trends are seen elsewhere, low-cost solar becoming dominant in 100% renewable scenarios, though the role of wind varies.
More significant in Sri Lanka than some parts of India, maybe.
That's what the study suggests.
Yeah.
It also mentions managing Sri Lanka's monsoon season periods of lower solar output requires that mix of solar, wind, storage, and power-to-X flexibility, similar to findings for Bangladesh.
Interesting regional context. Okay, so let's bring this deep dive to a close. The key takeaway from looking island-wide to overcome Sri Lanka's energy crisis while gaining independence from fossil fuel imports. What is it?
I think the study makes a really strong case that this transition isn't just a pipe dream. It argues that achieving 100% renewable energy by 2050, led by solar and backed by storage, is not only feasible for Sri Lanka.
And it's actually the smartest path forward. Economically sound, better for energy security, and obviously much better for the environment.
Exactly. The best policy scenario offers significant cost savings, a drastically reduced environmental footprint, and genuine energy independence compared to sticking with fossil fuels.
A compelling vision laid out by this research. So here's a final thought for you, our listener. Thinking about Sri Lanka's experience and the potential outlined in this study. What lessons can other nations, especially islands, heavily reliant on fuel imports and facing climate risks, take away?
Yeah, what role can really pushing for rapid renewable adoption play in building long-term resilience and sustainability, not just for one country, but maybe on a much wider global scale? Something to think about.